Fantastic. Good day, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here, albeit virtually. Um, Today, I'm calling in from the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong people, and I want to especially acknowledge that these are the lands that on which I live and work, and especially that these are unceded lands. Um, so. This paper examines how trans coming of age films disrupt the genre's normative teleologies, foregrounding queer temporalities that resist linear narratives of transition and development. My focus today, hopefully not too ambitiously, is on three films that have been released over the past decade. Marilyn from Martin Rodriguez Rodrigo from Argentina, a film 20,000 Species of Bees, which is a Spanish Basque production from Estibaliz Urresola, and Neubau by Johannes Maria Schmidt, which is a German production. So I want to kind of show that these films read together chart a movement from trauma through sensorial recognition to a kind of suspension of time. The coming of age narrative has conventionally been bound to teleology, a trajectory from childhood to adulthood, confusion to self-knowledge, marginality to belonging. Yet such frameworks privilege cis and heteronormative models of identity, of desire, and maturity. And so I too turn to Elizabeth Freeman's term chromonormativity, which usefully names this as a technique by which institutional forces come to seem like somatic facts. Coming of age stories have long been organized by this normative alignment of bodies to social time. For trans and gender non-conforming protagonists, this chromonormative model is especially fraught. As Neil Richardson and Frances Smith have observed, coming of age as a linear process is one of violence for these young trans people. So two concepts will guide my analysis here. Vibke Strauber's exitscapes, effective through spaces that create kind of temporary openings in otherwise hostile structures. And also Elisa Steinbock's concept of the shimmering image or the shimmer, which is the perceptual quality of change in its flickering emergent form. So across the films that I look at, exitscapes, and shimmer disrupt a kind of teleological closure and potentially open other ways of inhabiting time. To situate this, we need to recall how queer coming-of-age cinema has been understood. Brad Windhauser has usefully defined what he calls a kind of classic cluster of films that emerged in the 1990s, especially in the US. These films, that at the time were often labeled coming out narratives, became cultural touchstones, but followed a relatively fixed grammar. Some of the semantic elements of these will be pretty familiar. So we often have a queer protagonist at the kind of cusp or threshold age between childhood and adulthood. Often we find a high school as a setting for ostracism. There's often conflict with both parents and mainstream peers. We find often scenes of expulsion, the use of clothing as a means of experimenting with identity. There's often a mirror scene, which can be a kind of site of self-recognition. Romance and sexuality become tests of identity. Religion and other sort of moralities become obstacles. And often we find that there's kind of a big event that secures arrival into queer adulthood and is a kind of resolution. So, as Windhauser notes, everything else in these films, in protagonists' lives, tended to be confined to contributions or complications to this ultimate queer reveal. The cluster provided recognizable images for queer viewers, but also tethered queer cinema again towards a teleology in stories of discovery, crisis, and resolution. Trans cinema both inherits and unsettles this particular cluster. It repeats certain motifs, like the mirror, clothing, and family conflict, while interrupting the genre's temporal logic. What emerges instead are exitscapes and shimmering images that refuse closure. So before turning to recent films, we need to acknowledge the legacy that they inherit. In the 1990s, mainstream visibility for trans lives often arrived through trauma or portrayals of deception, quote unquote. Neil Jordan's The Crying Game turned gender revelation into a narrative twist. Kimberly Peirce's Boys Don't Cry centered on the murder of Brandon Teena. These were perhaps important or significant moments of visibility, but they tethered trans lives to suffering and tragedy. And yet, Boys Don't Cry also made possible something more. As Jack Halberstam influentially has argued, Peirce's film briefly constructed what he called a transgender gaze, a kind of spectatorial alignment with Brandon's embodied perspective, capable of seeing through the present to a future elsewhere. For a time, the spectator is drawn into Brandon's world of possibility, but this gaze was ultimately not sustained. The film's conclusion forecloses futurity, tethering trans life once again to death. Since then, trans cinema theory has sought other ways of naming these openings. So Straubers' concept of exitscapes and Steinbock's shimmer both attempt to grasp what flickers through in trans cinema. Moments of becoming that do not resolve into closure, but nevertheless matter. These frameworks allow us to read contemporary films not only for their tragic endpoints, but for the textures of possibility that we can find in them. So, Madeline is set in rural Argentina, and it adapts a real-life tragic story of Madeline Bernasconi. The film centers on its fictionalized version, Marcos, a teenager whose father's fragile support disappears after his sudden death. Marcus is then left under the rule of his mother, Olga, and brother, Carlitos. Marcus experiments with gendered self-expression, trying on dresses, applying makeup, photographing themselves furtively, and reveling briefly in the pleasures of Carnival. There's also a tender relationship with a neighboring Federico that hints at alternative futures. Yet, all these possibilities are ultimately violently curtailed. Marcus is assaulted by another neighbor, Facundo. He's beaten by his mother, and finally turns a shotgun on his family. The film's visual and tonal palette is subdued. We can kind of see in this image this sort of threatening tension of the neighborhood youths kind of following him on a motorbike. Domestic interiors frame Marcos in constricted spaces, while the exterior landscapes, although visually expansive, always bear a real sense of suffocation. It's heavy with silence and threat. The mise-en-scène in total always insists on claustrophobia, or almost always. But within this, exitscapes flicker. The most striking of these is the dancescape, in which Marcos, wearing wig and makeup, moves through space in the Carnival in a kinesthetic kind of abandon. Strauber writes of such scenes, they dancingly glide into kinesthetic positions, speaking without words, using movements culturally coded and dismissed as emotional and sensual. For a moment in these scenes, surveillance drops away, and the body itself becomes texture rather than object. The mirror is another important motif. As Jay Prosser has shown, the mirror is a privileged site of recognition in trans life writing. In Madeline, Marcus's selfies perform this kind of recognition, inviting the spectator to share in it. But these recognitions are fragile. They shimmer and then ultimately collapse when exposure arrives. Formally, Madeline belongs to what Venkatesh has described as the new Maricon cinema. This is a type of cinema that privileges images, sounds, textures, and surfaces that produce a polysensorial or haptic interaction with the moving image. The film's muted palette, its emphasis on silence, and attention to like fabric and gesture produce a sensorial density that implicates the spectator. Yet the film's trajectory ultimately remains tragic. Marcus's exitscapes are always foreclosed. Violence is what follows desire. Hill Malatino's critique of these narrow affective logics of trans representation, so that stories oscillate between extremes of dysphoria and euphoria, of feeling either terrible or feeling great, is definitely borne out in this film. Even the paradox of the real Marilyn intensifies this. It was only in prison that she is eventually able to live openly. Marilyn thus bridges trauma-centered narrative with a kind of haptic aesthetics, producing exitscapes that shimmer but ultimately collapse. In 20,000 Species of Bees, a holiday in the Basque country with a family becomes the setting for Lucia, who we see pictured here, um, for her affirmation of her name. Known at first as Aitor, nicknamed Coco, Lucia navigates hesitation from her mother Anna, pressures from an extended family, as well as the quiet support from a really cool Aunt Lourdes, who's a kind of chain-smoking beekeeper, whose warmth and self-possession anchor the film. The film draws on the trope of the summer holiday as a frame for self-discovery, a trope familiar from films such as Rossellini's Journey to Italy or even Guadagnino's Call Me By Your Name. But here, sexuality gives way to gender naming and recognition. Urosola transes this trope, staging not erotic awakening, but a sensorial emergence of a child's gendered self, a kind of coming to gender. Here, the haptic and sensorial motifs are clear. Anna, the mother's sculptural practice as an artist with wax and clay, evokes the malleability of embodiment. As Londroca has noted, the film refuses infantilization, offering its protagonist instead a leading role. The Aunt Lourdes bees create an ecology of care. But above all, water recurs as a motif. The river seems at once to cleanse, to offer possibilities of new beginnings, of different ways of being. It is also free from the anxieties of the public pool, where social anxieties produced by regimes institutionalized in, for example, changing rooms rule. A particular river sequence is perhaps the film's most powerful and luminous exitscape. Here, Lucia and her cousin discover a missing statue of John the Baptist that had been stolen, and the whole village has been searching for it. The cousins exchange swimsuits without hesitation, and Lucia announces her name to her cousin, which her cousin affirms quite casually. The camera, partially obscured by foliage, privileges ambient sound, water and insects over dialogue. This is a kind of like a haptic pseudo-baptism, consecrating Lucia's naming through texture and sound. Religion threads ambivalently throughout this film. It hinders where Lucia is scolded for wanting to wear a dress to a family baptism, but it empowers her when she learns of the story of Saint Lucia, from where she takes her name. The climax comes in a sequence where Lucia has escaped from this baptism, and the whole family is distraught, searching through the river. And at this point, we don't know if some tragic kind of tragedy has happened to Lucia. We see the mother, Anna, walking through, calling out Aitor, before eventually coming to terms and realizing this is fruitless and calling out with deep emotion Lucia into the forest. This cry reverberates, and we see the film cut to Lucia herself at the beehives replying, "Bees, it's me, Lucia." Naming becomes then enfolded into the environment, into religion, and especially into kinship. The shimmer here is tactile and auditory. We have water, wax, clay, insect hum, and above all, voice. Unlike in Marilyn, 20,000 Species of Bees refuses a necro narrative. It insists instead on recognition and on care. The film breaks with the conventional structures of mediated trans identities as problematic and instead opens up a new perspective, a space for imagining a future to become. Here, exitscapes are not fleeting or foreclosed, they become kind of sensorial sanctuaries. Neubau follows Marcus, pictured here, a trans man in his 30s, living in rural Brandenburg in Germany. His transition is behind him. His future is suspended between caregiving for his grandmother with Alzheimer's and longing for Berlin as a queer horizon. He also connects tentatively with Duck, a local man, but the film privileges atmosphere over any strong narrative arc. In a way, this is a kind of anti-coming of age film, perhaps radically challenging the genre by my including it in the genre. The opening of the film declares its sensibility. We have a black screen, we hear birdsong, we see a treescape, and then an intimate sex scene rendered very naturalistically, without music, before family obligation interrupts with a phone call from a confused grandmother. From the start, embodiment and kinship are foregrounded in the film. Unlike in the classic cluster, there's no adolescent discovery, no big event. In fact, not very much happens at all in this film. Instead, Neubau invests in shimmer. As Steinbock defines it, change in its emergent flickering form. Dream sequences puncture the narrative, accompanied by a metallic kind of drone. In these, Marcus imagines a queer community gathered around him in silence. These are Stauber's utopian sensibilities of imaginative possibility shimmering on the horizon. Exitscapes here are quiet and anticlimactic. Marcus dances alone in his home, cigarette and beer in hand. Pop music clashes with rural silence, producing much more atmosphere rather than resolution. Grinder messages with Duck build towards an anticlimactic meeting where Marcus explains the Ice Age geology of Brandenburg. Desire is displaced into a kind of deep time. Lots of everyday hesitations at the toilet in a restaurant, in hormone injection routines are foregrounded. These are kind of rarely cinematic subjects. As Hill Malatino has written, the traumas of the transmundane are what usually never make it onto the mainstream politico-cultural scene. Neubau here insists on them, staging suspension and drift as central to trans life. It performs what Malantino elsewhere calls future fatigue, declining the demand for optimistic closure. So if Marilyn offered exitscapes foreclosed and 20,000 species of bees crafted exitscapes that become habitable, Neubau here suspends us within the shimmer itself, not arrival, not catastrophe, but intervals. We can see here another scene of the hallucination of the queer community. So to conclude, taken together, these films demonstrate how trans coming-of-age cinema unsettles the genre's teleological assumptions. Marilyn reproduces trauma-centered tropes, but interrupts them with haptic exitscapes. 20,000 Species of Bees stages recognition through shimmer, water, wax, and naming, refusing a tragic closure. Neubau suspends progress entirely, dwelling in atmospheres of shimmer, registering the transmundane as affect. These works all inherit motifs from the queer coming-of-age cluster, like the mirror, clothing, parental tension, but refuse its syntax of resolution. Growing up here is not linear arrival, but instead texture, relation, and interval. Strauber reminds us that exitscapes are not counter-narratives, but stories within stories. Steinbock reminds us that the shimmering images make change perceptual as flicker and interval. Together, all these concepts illuminate how trans cinema retimes the coming-of-age form. If the classic cluster encoded queer adulthood through closure and arrival, I find that trans coming of age cinema, especially recent ones, invites us to linger otherwise, in exitscapes, in shimmer, in the not yet, in the moments that do not resolve but matter nevertheless. Thank you.